Thanks so much, Chris. All right. Juan P. Carmona is the author of The Alton Bus Crash. He's a social studies teacher at Donna High School and a dual enrollment history instructor through South Texas College. His primary field of research is the history of South Texas borderlands. Please welcome Juan P. Carmona.
Hello, everyone. The question I usually get answered when I do it, when anyone asks me about this book, is like, was I involved in the accident in any way? And my answer to that is no. But I had a couple of series of events in my life that kind of connected me to the accident itself, and to bus accidents in general. So the story has always remained with me. Now I'm going to read a little piece. Kind of the first real time I ever saw someone pass away. And it was directly connected to accidents. It was the usual hot valley afternoon, and my cousin Gabriel and I were walking home from school. We could feel the heat radiating from the black asphalt as we walked alongside old Highway 83. The highway ran the length of the Rio Grande Valley where I grew up. As the valley developed, it and the railroad tracks that are parallel to it were usually the dividing point between rich and poor, Anglo and Mexican. In Donna, where I grew up, it was the southern side for the Mexicans and the north side for the Anglos. One could easily assess this as you drove north and south of the city. For other cities in the valley, it was the opposite. However, there was always some sort of division. As we walked along the highway toward my house, we could feel the hot wind of the cars that flew by us and kicked up some of the ever-present dust, which accumulated on all things during the periods of drought. We had just come up to a neighborhood corner store that was along the way when a bus passed us. And just as it did, the emergency door flew open, and a young Mexican boy was flung out of the bus and landed on the road just before us. I froze. I can still see him lying there on his stomach a few feet away from me. His head turned to the left. I heard a crack as he hit the ground. His mouth was slightly open, and either from his mouth or his head, there was bright blood running along the black asphalt. I stood frozen and stared, shocked, fascinated, and afraid because I did not know what to do. The bus kept going unaware. It was minus one passenger. This is a time before cell phones or even 911, a time when you actually had to memorize numbers. And at that moment, my mind was blank. My cousin, on the other hand, knew exactly what to do. We ran toward the store and were met by the clerk who had seen what had happened from behind the counter. My cousin yelled, "Call the police." The clerk looked just as befuddled as myself. "I don't know." 464-4481, Gabriel yelled at him. "Call 464-4481. The young man from the store stood frozen, looked beyond us, the poor boy bleeding his life away on the asphalt. Gabriel ran in and made the call. I wish I could write more about what happened that day, but this is all I can recall. I didn't even go home and tell my family. I just went home, listened to the news, and heard he was, leaning against the emergency exit lever when it opened. That story has stayed in the recesses of my mind since it happened. Every time you hear about a school bus accident, that image of that boy lying on the ground with the color of the blood against the asphalt is what pops in my mind. That was the first image that came to me on September 21st, 1989, when someone came into Mrs. Morales' Spanish class and said that there had been a bus accident and some students had been killed. It was my first brush with death, and sadly for those students aboard Mission School Bus number 6, it was theirs as well. Except their experience was deeply personal, for although I did not know the boy who died on the road before my eyes, these students were intimately connected to the victims. They were their brothers, sisters, cousins, friends, and schoolmates. Their losses would leave a profound mark on them, their families, and their community. For them, the words tragedy and loss are not strong enough. Indeed, there is no combination of words nor book, nor volumes of books that could ever truly define their loss. And I'm quite honest when I tell you I can't remember anything else of that day. In fact, my dad got my book and called me very, very angry. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" And I was like, "Dad, I don't remember anything beyond what I just read to you is all I can remember." So I just kind of stayed there. I found out later, it took me forever to get a hold of my cousin again, but I found out later he actually knew who the boy was. He actually gave me a name. I never even had a name for that boy. His name was Frank Salazar. And in sharing the story, I've learned that the city I live in and now teach, his father was a bus driver in that same city. And he was still I was told he was still there a few years ago when he finally retired. But so that is why when I hear a bus accident, it just, it brings that memory back. And so when this happened, that's immediately what popped in my head. Now, coming off of what Chris's book is about, what is very fascinating when I finally sat to do the research for this is when in the entire time when the Rio Grande Valley is being shifted from ranching to agriculture, Alton is very different. And I want to read you a little piece of the history of Alton so I can connect it to what Chris was talking about. The city of Alton, Texas is located in the South Texas border region known as the Lower Rio Grande Valley. Most residents of the area refer to it as the RGV, Rio Grande Valley, or simply the Valley. The city was founded during a time of great change in the Rio Grande Valley. Its economy was shifting from a ranching to agricultural economy through the introduction of irrigation and railroads. In fact, it is from a railroad that the city gets its name, the Alton Railroad Company from the city of Alton, Illinois. The town was established in 1911 with an initial population of 50 residents. Railroads came to the RGV through a concerted effort of men like Richard King, John Kennedy, Jim Wells, John Armstrong, and Robert Driscoll, all of whom had within prior decades acquired large tracts of land from Mexican landowners who were forced to sell due to a drop in cattle prices, drought, inability to pay taxes, as well as through less honorable methods. This was a period of violence and terror for the Mexican American community of the Rio Grande Valley. These men saw the acquisition of this land as an investment whose return would come from a change in economies from ranching to farming. However, in order to sell the valley as a place to make money in agriculture, the area needed to be connected to the national market. And that meant a railroad was needed. However, Southern Pacific refused on the grounds that it would not be a profitable investment. So these men funded the creation of a railroad in the lower Rio Grande Valley. This combination of the connecting of the rails of the valley and the creation of irrigation districts succeeded in bringing about this transition. Despite the fact that the valley's main industry was switching to agriculture, this was not the industry on which Alton would be centered. Alton's product would be the very ground on which it was founded. The city would provide caliche sedimentary rock for construction projects throughout the country. Tragically, caliche extraction in the pits it created would be indelibly linked to the heartbreak that occurred on September 21st, 1989. And the reason it is so connected is what happens is the bus that was carrying these children was hit by a Dr. Pepper truck owned by Valley Coca-Cola, and it went directly into an open caliche pit full of water. So much water that laying on its side, it covered the bus completely. And what is really sad when I did the research and I was just looking at these pictures, is from the side of the bus laying on its side to the surface is about this much water. And so like the creation of Alton became what led to this tragedy. The very basis of its creation in the time period where we're going from ranching to farming and all this, for the summer, the ground there is literally what builds the skyscrapers in other places. But this, where it gets its name from is also now it has a new, its name is connected to a big tragedy connected to those pits. Let me continue a little more. The city grew slowly. It maintained its own post office from 1913 to 1916, after which it was run out by the larger neighboring city of Mission. It could be the same story for its school. The schoolhouse was your typical rural 6th grade school named Alton School after the city. It was managed under Hidalgo County School Superintendent, but like the post office, it was annexed into the Mission Consolidated Independent School District. The school still exists as Alton Elementary within the Mission School District. It was a Mission school bus that the students were riding on that calamitous day. Alton would not be officially chartered until April 1st, 1978. In its infancy, the city's manager, mayor, and 4 aldermen met in a rented room. Eventually, they were able to purchase a church house, which became City Hall. In time, And through federal housing grants, the city expanded its services, providing all the major utilities to the residents. Then it began to promote more commercial development, and the city began to grow. At its birth in 1978, Alton elected its first mayor, Miss San Juanita Zamora. She was the mayor of the city during the Alton school bus tragedy. Life for the students who boarded Mission CISD school bus number 6 was pretty much a shared experience, that they were all around the same age and attended the same schools, high and middle school. The Caliche Pit was the biggest attraction in the neighborhood. It was a place all the students were familiar with and played around. Many of them played hide and seek or simply hung out around the pit the bus would fall into. There was no barrier or fence to keep them away from the area. One of the main issues is whose solutions would be demanded after the accident. Another hangout spot for the kids in the neighborhood was a pool at nearby Palm Lake Estates apartment complex. In the interview, a survivor pointed out it was a kind of sad because we would all swim and most of these people drowned, and you don't expect that. I didn't expect it, and it really hurts now, it really hurts. The neighborhood itself at the time attracted very little commercial development. There were no big chain grocery stores like H-E-B or Walmart. It was mostly small neighborhood stores where families would shop for their essentials, or kids would walk over for candy or a cold drink on hot valley days. In the neighborhood there lived a man named Roque Sosa, who had a small ranch with horses and chickens. He offered the children's jobs feeding the chickens and horses and grooming them. He let the children ride the horses, and at times he gave some of the boys money for helping break the horses. His home was another local fixture where neighborhoods could be found, and where neighborhood kids could be found. Now, I tell that about Roque Sosa because when I interviewed one of the survivors, he describes what happened is when the bus first, because it's complete, like you got to imagine seeing a road and it's just completely open and there's a pit and there's water. In fact, a week before, another group of teenagers had their car had fallen in. And they were already talking like, maybe we should put a barrier or something, but it was still open. Because it was the blame game, like, oh, that's not the city's responsibility, it's the county's responsibility. The county's like, no, that's a state responsibility. The state's like, well, yeah, that's Railroad Commission's responsibility, and nothing ever got done, and the pit remained open. So, in a quick description of the accident, the bus is driving along 5 Mile Line Bryan Road, and a Dr. Pepper truck comes through, and it runs a stop sign. The driver will later claim the brakes weren't working, and it hits the bus, and it shoves it toward the pit. But what really shoved the bus the rest of the way was that the Dr. Pepper truck was fully loaded. He had only made one stop, so that all the beverages were still in the truck, making it very, very heavy. And the tail of it swung and swatted the back of the bus and sent it into the pit. And he describes it as they all knew that the pit was full of water. They knew where they were headed. And the survivors described that, this is a moment of quiet. They just realize what's about to happen, and he just says, not him, more than one survivor described the same thing. Everything just went quiet. Then they went nose first into the water, then the bus was leaning, and then it fell on the side. And so the only means of escape for those children were the windows on the side of the bus. And you may see buses today, and they are completely redesigned because of this accident. At that time, the windows were much smaller, and the only way to open windows back then was you had to push these metal clasps really, really hard, and it would just come down a little and a little. And so that was the only means of escape for these children. They were middle and high school students. So there was 83 people on that bus, if you can imagine. 21 kids died from that accident. And the coroner ruled that they died from drowning. That the accident was survived. They didn't die from injuries from the accident. So had they gotten out, they would have survived. And so to me, it's amazing that 60 did get out. So when they get out, the only way is through the windows, and they start pulling each other up as best they can. And there's lots of sad stories about them, only coming up with pieces of hair or clothing. One of the most tragic stories is 2 brothers. One brother got out, couldn't see his other brother, and jumped back in and never came back out himself. And so as they're getting out, one of the main persons I interviewed, his name is Alex De Leon, and he's standing on the bus. He got his sister out. He was there with his sister and some other people out, and he hears a man yelling at the top of what is a cliff to him. Because it's 30 feet, and for the bus is 30 feet to the edge, and it literally looks like a cliff. And he hears, and it's Roque Sosa, who lives nearby. And he tells him, swim for it. And he throws something in the water. And so Alex swims, grabs it, he thought it was a rope, and it turned out to be 2 water hoses tied together. And he starts to pull him up quite quickly, and Alex, man, this guy is strong. And he gets to the top, and he notices that Roque Sosa is sitting on a horse, and the horse is what's pulling him up. And I just think to myself, the wherewithal for him to instantly like grab 2 long water hoses, time to get on a horse, ride over there, and then start to pull kids out. And he's one of the unsung heroes of the whole thing. He was one of the first people there. Immediately, like I mentioned there's no cell phones, there's no, and it's just pure chaos. Most of the kids that were on that bus are all from the same neighborhood. A lot of those people were very poor. They're mostly Mexican Americans, very, very poor. Some of them didn't have electricity. Some of them didn't even have floors in their homes. But they all kind of lived in the area, and they could hear commotion. So however they heard you yelling, screaming, banging on doors, they all rushed. And at the same time, people passing by started to stop. And pretty much everybody and anybody who could help showed up. I mean, you had the Border Patrol, you had the state troopers, you had the county sheriff. Every fire department in the Rio Grande Valley showed up with boats, and divers showed up to help bring, pull kids out or bring the bodies out, as would later happen after so much time. And so it's this huge community response, but it's very, very just like disorganized because everyone's just showing up and trying to do what they can do. And then you also have instances of like parents trying to jump in to get their kids, and then parents just trying to find their kids because there's no calling, they didn't have phones or anything. And I just can't imagine as a parent going to the pit, going to where they have all the bodies, going to the hospitals nearby to try to find your child. And I can't imagine that panic that must have gone through them. So anyway, one of the things that really, like as I pointed out earlier, one of the things that to me, I needed to tell the story is I work in a high school. I ride on buses when I go on school trips. I see buses all the time. And those buses are so much safer today because of this accident. I always find it sad that it takes a huge tragedy to, we should do something about that. So today you'll see school buses with hatches on the roofs. The windows are much bigger and easier to open. And even whole sides will open. And all this is because of this. There's a company in Michigan that actually would drop buses into water after this accident to figure out what they could do. And one thing they immediately figured out is if you drop a bus in water, it fills with water quite quickly. Cars float. Like if you see in the movies all the time, and it is true, cars will float for a bit and come down. So you actually kind of have time. But buses, the water would rush in immediately. And so I had another connection to this. And I'll go ahead and read from that part. There it is. Thought I bookmarked it. In my own voice interjecting this because this is also like how another connection I have. I first heard the bus accident morning when I was in Miss Morales' Spanish 1 class. I remember one of the student office runners relayed the story to the whole class. Questions sprung up immediately, but the young girl could only repeat what she was told. The remainder of that class period, things were a little quieter, and even Mrs. Morales ceased teaching as we all just sat and discussed what those poor students were going through. Much like the mission schools, information was passed through word of mouth throughout the course of the day. Then we all went home to watch the news and see footage from the tragedy. The rest of the day and the week went by with some mention of the story, but not too much until the next Friday, the day of the football game. That game would be played against Mission High School. I was a clarinet player in the band and a member of the loading crew, which meant we loaded up all the instruments in the bus. Clarinets and other small instruments would be carried in the bus with their owner. Instruments like tubas, drums, trombones, and more were placed in their cases inside a moving truck. We had to get to the school earlier than others to do this, and we would leave the game early in the fourth quarter to get all the cases ready for the people to put them into and be loaded onto the truck. We did not wear our uniforms to the game. It was simply too hot, so we placed them in garment bags and hung them from windows until we got to the school where we were playing. I remember that day our band director stressed that we make sure and place our garment bags in the windows and keep our smaller instruments in the bus with us because they were afraid that there might be some trouble. In truth, we knew one of the reasons we placed our bags on the windows was some high school football games fomented animosity between both sides, especially if there was already an inter-school rivalry. One dangerous result of a rivalry is that at times buses got attacked by people throwing rocks. So the reminder from our director seemed unusual because it was already common practice. However, we did what we were told, and all the windows had garment bags. We arrived at Mission High School and began to unload the bus. From the moment we set foot on the campus, you could feel an air of tension that went beyond the usual game day rivalry. As the game progressed in the first half, we could see fights breaking out in the stands and among the players. This we had not seen before, at least not on that level. Our director, Mr. Barkill, seemed bewildered by all of what was transpiring around us. Usually after performing halftime shows, we were allowed the first half of the third quarter to get something to eat. But that Friday night, that was not the case. We had heard a rumor one of the football players' parents attempted to hit one of the referees with his car, and that was enough for Mr. Parkhill. He sought out the members of the loading crew and told us we were going to leave soon and to begin to unload the cases from the truck. We did this without question. Many of us were feeling the same fear he was, and we were more than happy to leave early. As we were unloading the cases, we began to hear rumors there were people lining up along our route to throw rocks at the bus, and so our sense of urgency increased. Once the rest of the band joined us, we did our best to get everything loaded on the truck as fast as we could. However, there seemed to be some delay in actually leaving the school. By the time we made it out, the game was already finishing, so we waited to leave altogether. The delay came from the drivers trying to find a different route back home. Right before the bus departed, we were told that those of us with instruments in the bus had to place them against the windows for protection. After what seemed like a long trip at the beginning, we did hear things hitting our bus. We finally made it back to our high school. When we got off the bus, we heard that one of the Diettes, our dance troupe, Patricia Guerrero, had been struck by broken glass in her eye as an object smashed the window next to her. We unloaded the bus feeling scared and bewildered by the events of the evening. The practice of covering up the bus windows with our uniforms would take on more of a serious tone from then on. Now, one thing I need to mention before I read that is, the bus accident was on Thursday. That Friday, they actually canceled the full game for Mission that day because they had a huge memorial. 10,000 people showed up. And what was fascinating, one of the families told me, is that they released like a bunch of one balloon for every child that died, and that somehow all the balloons gathered together in the middle of the field and went up together, and they just saw it as a sign that they were all together. But and so that was that Friday, and so the scene I just described to you was the next Friday. And I can, and that is still seared in my mind. And I can just, for me, I think about just like the enormous loss and knowing, and the blame, and just how the whole world must have been turned upside down at that school. And yeah, there was rivals like that all the time. That was nothing new, except that it was just so much more that day. But yeah, we would always get rocked. I don't know. I asked some of my students today, and they're like, "It's not that bad anymore." They don't remember it being that bad anymore. But I remember it was like almost common, especially when we played our neighbors, Westlaco, or some other other places. We would, that we had rivalries with. We would see that. But that's another way I was connected to the story. Changes did come about because of that accident, like I mentioned earlier. And that to me is, a good positive that comes out of it. Now, one more thing I'll get into, and before I close this, is what immediately happens after, the community comes in, everyone comes in, brings money, brings supplies. One of the persons I interviewed was the spokesperson of Coca-Cola, because the Dr. Record truck that was being driven was owned by Valley Coca-Cola. She was actually given a blank checkbook and a notebook. Whatever people want, you give it to them. Like, all you gotta do is get them fill out, like, so-and-so wants this. And she actually gave us that ledger, so I was able to go through and see what the stuff that was given out. Sometimes it was clothes, new school supplies, money so that family could come in for the funeral, clothes for the funeral, for the students that passed, or for the family. And so immediately Coca-Cola did that. Also though, but she was also told the minute they retain lawyers, you can't give them any more money. And that was the other side of this whole thing. Is that, you hear the words Coca-Cola, billion-dollar industry. So lawyers came from all around. Some local, some not local. And many people were taken advantage of. Ambulance chasing, or the legal word is barratry, was so bad that the American Bar Association had to send a crisis team down because there was at least 16 charges of barratry, which is basically ambulance chasing. One of the people I interviewed said that they just reached into the hospital bed of their child and you could just pull out a handful of cards that were being shoved into the bed from different lawyers. There was infighting, as some people got more than others. A lot of people just didn't know how the legal system worked. They were being charged 45% or more. And so they were completely taking advantage of. So this is another side of the story. And recently, that happened in September. In December before that, and I write, give a little history in the book. There was a previous accident. It was a store known as the Amigo store. And there was a lot of rain. It had 3 floors, and the roof collapsed, kind of pancaked down, killing people. And so lawsuits for that are going through the court system. It's the same time as the lawsuits for the Alta bus crash. And to this day, the Rio Grande Valley, where I'm from, is the most sued region, and also considered a region where people pay out. So national cases have gone to our area, like Biox and Goodyear, when the Goodyear tires are, exploding and people were being killed. All those cases were actually tried in McAllen, in the Rio Grande Valley. And a lot of people like to try to have their cases heard here because we got that reputation from this time period about a place where juries pay out. Millions were paid out. To those that lost people, millions were paid out. Survivors got $300,000 to $500,000 apiece. And another part of that story and tragedy is that some used it. You get almost like the story of some lottery winners. Some would go through it, didn't quite know how to handle it. You buy a big home, you don't realize you pay taxes on that home, and eventually, you got one check for millions, and that's all you're ever going to get. Some did good. Some used it to start businesses. One person in particular went to law school. There was good and bad of it, but it also created animosity in the community when people that were very poor suddenly became very rich, and people nearby were like, "Well, why don't you spread that wealth around?" One interesting example was the local parish priest, who was told by all the other priests, "Oh, you're going to get so much money in your church, and it's going to get all built up because of all the money coming in, from your parishioners." So that becomes its own story in itself, is what happens with the the legality of it. Then of course the criminal case, because Ruben Bettis-Arun, who drove the Dr. Pepper truck, who said the brakes failed, he gets charged with 21 counts of manslaughter. And so he goes to trial. And unfortunately for the district attorney who I interviewed, one of those things you don't think about, I just want to talk to the district attorney, and I didn't realize, the first thing he told me is I lost that case. And I'm like, oh yeah, you lost it. And when I'm reading about the trial, it almost, most of the witnesses he brings actually helped the defense. Because initially when the 21 counts come, because the NTSB comes down, and they initially examine the truck, they're able to get the truck to stop in time. So they're like, there's nothing wrong with the brakes, so they say it's driver's inattention that caused the accident, so it gets 21 counts of manslaughter. In further examination, the brake expert, Dan Aza, examines the brakes, and they did find sludge and water in the brake lines. And what he just said was, that means that bus could stop sometimes, and other times it wouldn't. It just depends where that sludge is. So it added that reasonable doubt as to whether it stopped or not. So yes, the young man does become acquitted. The judge, even in the middle of the trial, reduces it from from manslaughter to negligent homicide. Because he even recognizes that they're probably not going to get a manslaughter conviction, so he lowers it, and he's eventually found not guilty. And so, there's no real answer to whose fault it was. And then, as the coroner points out, that was a survivable crash if they could have just gotten out. So then the blame is put back to Valley of Coca-Cola, the Bluebird Bus Company, who made the bus, and makes most of the buses today. But in their defense, their buses were up to specs. The time period, the regulations at that time, they were within those regulations. So they were building as they were told to be built. But this tragedy, wasn't foreseen. One last piece I'll read to you. As I was finishing this book, like I know that new things that happened had been put into buses, so I'm like, I bet you, I want to find a story that shows the change, the change helped. So one last thing I'll read. Find it real quick. October 3rd, 2018, Mesquite, Texas. A bus carrying 42 Mesquite ISD students had its rear wheels veer off the road into some grass, causing the driver, John Johnson, to overcorrect, sending the bus into oncoming traffic. The driver then quickly tried to steer the bus back into the correct lane, sending the bus off the road again, onto its side and into a utility pole. The pole and its live wire coursing with electricity fell down on top of the bus and caused it to burst into flames. The students, with the help of bystanders, managed to exit the vehicle, both through the back emergency door exit and the rooftop hatches. Despite everyone's best efforts, one child, 12-year-old Jasmine Alfaro, lost her life that day. However, the other children lived, some of whom survived thanks to emergency hatches that had been placed on the roof of the bus because 21 children died in the Caliche pit in Malvern, Texas. And before I end, I do want to do one thing because I've been mentioning the accident and everything, but I haven't mentioned the children. So I would like to read the names of the 21 children who passed that day. Maria Alfaro, Roberto Bazalua Jr., Margarita Wendell, Carmen Canales, Elda P. Cruz, Raul Flores, Abdon Garcia, Armando Gonzalez, Ruby Lopez, Marta Amelia Lozano, Jose L. Ortega, Veronica Perez y Senia Perez, sisters. Roman Quintero, Apolonia Regalado, Maria Regalado, sisters. Ana Delia Rodriguez, David Saenz, Michael P. Saenz, the brothers that when got back out and jumped back in. Albert Vasquez, and the last one to pass away, Elizabeth Flores. And one thing I forgot to mention, Elizabeth Flores is the last one to pass away. I told my students about the book I was writing, and one of them went home and told their mom, and she said her mom just burst into tears. And she said, because Elizabeth Flores was her friend, and she died holding her hand. And it's just a testimony to how small the community is in the Rio Grande Valley. Because I teach in Donna. Donna is about 30 miles away from this city. And, just the fact that, and she said her mom had never told her that until she, brought this up. Thank you.